And hey guys, it's Mr. Sisson, and what we're asking you to do in this Factions project is we're asking you to take Romeo and Juliet and then to place it within a factional conflict in United States history, to adapt it to a different time period. And so it's not just like saying, it's not just choosing the year that you would like to adapt your play to. It's not even necessarily just choosing a conflict. It's choosing a factional conflict and understanding how that conflict played out over time. And so I'm going to walk you through hopefully a pretty quick workshop where you can get a decent understanding of what that means. Whenever we say factional conflict, what are we talking about? And what are the types of things that you need to understand about yours, about the factional conflict that you chose? So this is an analysis, a brief analysis of factional conflicts. So at the very beginning of our country, George Washington was president. You probably knew that. But whenever he left office, he chose to leave. He made his own choice. He wasn't voted out of office. He just decided that he wasn't going to run for a third term. And before he left, he wrote this farewell address. And it's one of these classic pieces from American history, this classic writing. And one of the things that he talked about, and I've shortened this quote, and hopefully I can explain it for you at least a little bit, is one of the main things he warned about was a spirit of faction. So he said this: the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension or disagreement, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, these would be like crimes, is itself a frightful despotism. This is like if you have a despotic government, it's suppressive. It's not a good place to be if you're an individual. It can be a really hurtful and overpowering government. What he's saying is basically this desire for one faction to dominate another, which is part of parties. So parties, what he's talking about here would be like Democrats and Republicans today. That if you have parties, they want to dominate each other, and those are separate factions. And it can be the cause of some of the most horrible crimes and despotic governments. So that was one of his big warnings, Washington's warning. Well, here's what's interesting about our country, is we have so many different legacies and backgrounds and cultures that are represented in our country. And so, we've got the Native Americans, Spanish, English, African, Dutch, French, German, Irish ancestry, Chinese ancestry, Norwegian, Mexican, Russian, Turkish, Armenian, Filipino, Korean. You guys get it. I don't know why I decided to stop as I got to the last four, but basically there are a whole lot of different cultures represented in America. So we're a nation of immigrants. So each immigrant population brought their own culture, their own values, their own religions, and their own ideologies. And so what that meant is we're very, very diverse. Well, what's interesting about that is when you start talking about factions. Factions are a smaller organized group within a larger body of people formed around a specific viewpoint. Well, in some countries, you may not have all of these different countries represented, or all these different cultures represented. And so it may even be less likely to devolve into factional conflicts. But in our country, we've got all these different ideologies, all these different cultures represented. So it's much easier for a smaller organized group to emerge within a larger body of people, and they may have a specific viewpoint. Down here, we'll talk about these a little bit sooner, but we've got two differing viewpoints, both involved in the United States, both part of the United States, and both surrounding prohibition or the banning of alcohol. Over here, you've got a big group of people dumping out alcohol, all smiling, very happy. Over here, you have a big group of people all drinking alcohol, all smiling, all happy. They both wanted different things. So, going back to George Washington. He was president, and he tried to be nonpartisan, which meant that he is... So a partisan is a strong supporter of a group or a cause. He was nonpartisan, which meant he tried not to fall into one group or the other. If George Washington was alive today, he'd be the guy that said, no, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I just try to make the best decisions possible. What's interesting is Washington's cabinet was made up of his two leading advisors were Alexander Hamilton, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was the head of the Federalist Party. He belonged to the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State, was one of the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party, or the Republican Party. So Washington didn't want to be part of a factional conflict. He didn't want to be part of bickering groups. But his two leading advisors were aggressively opposed to each other. Alexander Hamilton, Federalist, had views for big government, manufacturing. He wanted a national bank. He wanted big government policies. Jefferson, Democratic Republicans, wanted smaller government, didn't want a national bank, wanted farms and an agrarian, agricultural country. So these guys were really opposed. Washington tried to stay above it. Well, even Washington, the guy that we can admire for a lot of things that he did right, he could not prevent this split that occurred. This factional conflict between Federalists and Democratic Republicans split the cabinet and really even pulled Washington more towards the Federalist side. So what can we learn from this? If Washington couldn't prevent it, although most Americans would recognize factional disputes are not good for the country, they are awfully hard to avoid in a pluralistic society like the United States. This pluralistic society that's made up of all sorts of different backgrounds, cultures, beliefs, ideologies. People are going to disagree in this country. It's inevitable. So then what? A pluralistic society, I guess I should have put this up there, is a culture which has the conviction that various religious, ethnic, racial, and political groups should be able to thrive in a single society. What this means is we don't all have to be the same. And we hopefully understand that it's good to have differences, even though sometimes it seems like we forget that. So I'm going to skip past this. And these are some pictures of factional conflicts. We talked about how there would be disagreement. Well, here are some examples. Before we were even a country, you had Americans that disagreed with the way the British were running the country because these were colonial Americans who lived in the country. And a lot of these, I wouldn't say a lot of the British soldiers, but you had a lot of the leading British decision makers, the ones that had the power, were not from colonial America. Down here, you've got the Vietnam War, and you have a group of, or a large collection of young people that really opposed the draft and fighting in Vietnam. Up here, you have the civil rights movement. You may remember that we talked about this picture at the beginning of the year, but you had very different views on race in the South. The Civil War is a classic factional conflict. The women's rights movement, you could go all the way back to the 1800s, but even up into the 60s and 70s, and you could even say today. So here are the parts of a factional conflict, and these are the things that you need to understand for your conflict as you start building your adaptation. People are central to any factional conflict. As the great Atticus Finch says in To Kill a Mockingbird, even mobs are made up of individuals, so it's not just groups. When discovering which actors were a part of your factional conflict, you'll need to ask these questions. Who are the factions, or who were the factions involved in the conflict? I need to change that verb. Who were some major individuals involved in the conflict? So who are the factions, and who are the leaders of those factions? Some examples would be if you did the Revolutionary War, you've got British and colonial Americans, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, you could say King George III, even though he wasn't really over here, it'd be hard to make it work. But the American Civil War, you could have Confederate and Union soldiers, Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant. But you need to know who some of those people are, which means you're going to need to do a little bit of research on your factional conflict. Then you need to know what their positions are. So a faction's position is what the faction says they want. This is just what they want. Notice that a faction's position does not tell the whole story. It only explains what a group wants, not why they want it. So an example, Vietnam War protesters wanted peace, or maybe they didn't want to go to war. Maybe they didn't want to have to fight themselves. Susan B. Anthony wanted women's suffrage, wanted the right to vote. I wanted to buy Battlefield 1. That was That was a pretty awesome video game that I was not very good at. Interests is a little bit different, a little bit more specific. So a faction's interest is why they want what they say they want. So if before we had what they wanted, this is the reasoning why. This is the motivation for any factional conflict. It may be obvious or it may be a secret. Someone may not want you to know why they're asking for a certain thing. So examples would be Vietnam War protesters wanted peace because they didn't want to fight themselves. Susan B. Anthony wanted women's suffrage because she believed women needed a say in government for it to be equal. I wanted Battlefield 1 because I love fake flying video game airplanes. That's true. I'm not good at it, but I like it. Then, and this is really critical, you have triggers. So opposing factions could live alongside each other for a long time, tolerating each other's opposing viewpoints. This happens in America all the time. People disagree, but it's not like a reason to really find yourself in opposition with each other. So for a factional conflict to arise, there's got to be a trigger or an event that sparks an escalation in the opposition. And this is something you really want for your factional conflict. What sparked the factional split? What sparked the people dividing into separate groups? So the civil rights movement, you could say Brown versus Board of Education. And this is an argument too. You might say something different. But you might say, hey, whenever the Supreme Court said that African Americans and white kids need to be able to go to school together, that was a trigger that then caused this massive split between Americans based on their view on race. The Civil War, you could say it was the Confederates firing on Fort Sumter. That's what started the factional conflict. Some people in the South might have said, no, that's not what it was. It was when those Northerners elected Abraham Lincoln. But that's what caused the split. The War on Terror, you could say, is September 11th, 2001. So this is what it would look like. So using that Revolutionary War example that we were talking about earlier, if we were looking at that and we wanted to break down that factional conflict, we've got two sides, the British and the colonial Americans. The actors, well, you had, let's say, British soldiers. What did they want, or the British government? What did they want? They wanted money. They needed money to pay to protect the colonies from Native Americans and French attacks and things like that. Why did they want it? Because of that. So they wanted money. That's what they wanted. Why did they want it? Because it was really expensive to protect the colonies. Well, what was the trigger? You could argue that was whenever, this is Lexington and Concord. So the first shots of the Revolution outside of Boston at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. That started the split, so then you would have to choose sides. Colonial Americans, who were their actors? Well, those were people that lived in the colonies. What were their positions? Well, they wanted authority. They wanted control over the places that they lived. Why? Well, they believed that you had a right to, have a say in how you were governed. And they didn't feel like they had that. They felt like they were subjected a lot to what Britain wanted. So that was why they wanted control over their own destinies, their own states. And you could say, and so their trigger, whether it was Lexington and Concord or the signing of the Declaration of Independence or the Boston Massacre, all of those things served to split people who could have lived in peace beside each other, British people and colonial Americans. That happened for a long time, that caused them to split. So let's look at a quick example for today, and then hopefully I'll get you through this pretty quickly. So today, you've got a big group of Americans. Actually, I'm going to go back to an example from last year. So it's 2016. You've got a large group of Americans. And within that group, this would be kind of a topical thing even today, but especially about a year ago. You had people with different beliefs. So up in the top left corner, you have people, we're talking about Syrian refugees. You have people who are indifferent to accepting Syrian refugees up here in this corner. Indifferent means just they don't really care one way or the other. Over here you have people scared of terrorists coming in among Syrian refugees. That's like in this group of people. Down here you have people who are strongly opposed to accepting Syrian refugees. They do not want Syrian refugees getting into America. And over here you have people strongly in favor of accepting Syrian refugees. And they see the devastation that's occurred, and they say we have a responsibility to offer safety and shelter for those people. So, what's the trigger? Let's say the 2016 election. Because all these people are living alongside each other for a while there. And then the 2016 election came along, and all of a sudden this issue gets pulled to the forefront. It gets pulled to, it's like a headline issue. And what happens is you have two groups of people that decide this is where I'm going. So people who are strongly opposed to accepting Syrian refugees would have seen Donald Trump as the candidate for like, okay, this guy is speaking my language, and that's who I'm going to support. Over here, you'd have people who are like, no, we should accept them, and they would have said Hillary Clinton, she is speaking my language, and that's who I'm going to support. And you may realize in the middle that there are still two groups of people that are kind of like, well, I don't know, I kind of don't have a real strong opinion, or I'm a little scared that maybe there are terrorists among the Syrian refugees, but they didn't have a strong opinion. But the arguments that occurred here and among all of us, we can't accept them. Yes, we need to. We can't. What you'll find is factional conflicts make it really difficult to stay in the middle. And eventually a line is drawn and you find yourself pulled one way or the other. So those people who are like, you know what, maybe there are terrorists among the Syrian refugees, may quietly find themselves yanked to this side, and now they're stuck over here. And these people are like, well, I guess I don't really care, but you know what, maybe it is our responsibility. Slowly get pulled this way, and now there's a huge dividing line between these factions. And so you might think about that in regards to Romeo and Juliet. What happened? Everybody gets sucked into it. So Mercutio isn't a Montague, and he's not a Capulet. He kind of sits in the middle. What happens to him? He falls victim to the factional conflict. Paris isn't a Capulet. He's not a Montague. What happens to him? Falls victim to the factional conflict. And so that's what they tend to do. All right. So hopefully that gives you a decent idea. The things that you want to be thinking about for your factional conflict are these things. Who are the actors? What were their positions? What were their interests? And what was the trigger that set off your factional conflict?